Hello, welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about everything that I read and watched for Jane Austen July. First I'll start off with the book that I DNF'd. According to this bookmark, I only managed to get to page 60 with this one. This is The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. I was not really gelling with the writing style, which is usually the main reason why I will DNF a book. This is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice from Mary Bennet's point of view, but I didn't quite realise that the retelling aspect meant that it was going through the same story as Pride and Prejudice. So I found I was just reading a lot of explanation about the story of Pride and Prejudice that I already knew. I get obviously that the author has to set the scene, but I feel like really the only people who are going to be reading this are people who have already read Pride and Prejudice, so I felt like the amount of explanation that was included was kind of unnecessary. And I found the characterization of Mary Bennet just not that imaginative. It felt really obvious. At that point in the book, I didn't feel like I was getting anything new out of the story that I was hoping to get. If anyone has read this book, let me know if I should continue reading. So the novel by Jane Austen that I read was Persuasion. I was hoping to really enjoy this book. I remember enjoying it pretty well the first time that I read it. I was a little bit disappointed. It wasn't engaging me as much as I thought it would. I found Anne's character quite dull to read about, and I get that that is her character. She is the sort of normal one amongst all these slightly insane people that she lives among, and that her character is to be the quiet, passive one, looking out for everyone else. But I definitely was more interested in reading about the other characters. They are just more entertaining. I think I enjoyed it the more it went along, and as the romance between her and Captain Wentworth gets more heated and the yearning becomes more yearning-y, if that's a word, it started to get a lot more engaging, I think. What I especially found fascinating about this novel was how much real-life places are a part of the story, which is not so much the case in her other novels, which are often set in fictional places based on real places in England. But you cannot think about Persuasion without thinking about Bath, and of course without thinking about Lyme, where the infamous jumping off some very high steps event happens. Anne's absolute love of Lyme and her distaste for Bath are so clearly described in the book that you definitely feel like they're coming from a personal place for Jane Austen, and it gives you such a lovely peek into what the world might have been really like for Jane Austen, imagining her in these real life places that she's describing. And seeing as I'm talking about Persuasion, I may as well talk about how I watched the 1995 adaptation of Persuasion. This is a film version. I think it was made for TV, but it doesn't feel at all like a TV film. It is incredibly cinematic. It stars Amanda Root as Anne and Kieran Hines, I think you say it, as Captain Wentworth. And this is one of those occasions where I actually prefer the adaptation over the original book. I love this film. I think it is my favourite Jane Austen adaptation of all time, which is a big thing to say, and I love so many of them, but this one for me is the ultimate in 90s naturalism. Everything is filmed by natural daylight or candlelight. All the characters feel incredibly lived in. They have this real life dishevelment to them, but without being over the top in the way the 2005 Pride and Prejudice went. The beautiful piano music sets the tone amazingly, and all the yearning of the book comes out in full force in this film. I think it's a lot easier to sympathise with a quiet character when you can see them on screen and you can see their facial expressions, and Amanda Root does an incredible job of letting us know exactly what Anne's feeling all the time while not really saying much at all. So if you haven't seen that adaptation yet, I'd very much recommend watching it. It is available on YouTube. Next, I read my favourite thing that I read for Jane Austen July, which was Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. This is a non-fiction book by the historian Lucy Worsley, who's a pretty famous historian in the UK, and it looks at the life of Jane Austen through the homes that she lived in. I think this was quite a clever way to frame a book about Jane Austen, because there is so little information about her really, and a lot of it has been obscured by her family in the Victorian age, trying to make her sound a lot nicer and more pious than she probably was, or at least what we can tell she might have been like from the letters that remain, because a lot of her letters were destroyed by her sister Cassandra. You really get so much information about what it was like to live in the Georgian and the Regency era. You get so much information about her family and her extended family. It talks all about the historical events that were happening, particularly the Napoleonic Wars. Anything that might have influenced the way Jane Austen thought and write is discussed in this book. It really places her in the time that she lived through, and I just found that really fascinating to read and gave so much insight about why she wrote the the kind of stories that she did, why they were so groundbreaking at the time. It really makes sense of all the different decisions that she made for her characters. For example, the emphasis on homes that runs throughout all of her novels, the way that a lot of her characters, although it's framed as them having a happy ending by finding a husband, what most of them are really doing are finding houses. There's always that famous line about Lizzie falling in love with Mr. Darcy after she saw his amazing house at Pemberley, and that's a theme that just runs throughout so many of her works. I really liked the way the book was written as well. It was very accessible in its writing style, had lots of quotes from different people of the time, but the way it was laid out was, if you wanted to know where each quote or each piece of information came from, there was a number. You could go to the back of the book and find out more information about that, but it wasn't completely interwoven into the text. So if you just wanted to read it in a more flowing way, then you could, and that's what I did. For me, I wasn't too fussed about where Lucy Worsley got her info. I trusted that she had found it from the right sources and just enjoyed the way that she is really good at writing a narrative. If you're at all interested in finding out more about Jane Austen, I would highly recommend this book. I did know a relative amount about Jane Austen and her family and her life before reading this book, so all the descriptions of the different places and people that she met were vaguely familiar to me. I don't know whether it would be a bit more confusing if this was your first experience in reading about or learning about Jane Austen's life. So the last thing I read was the collection of her short novels and unfinished works. Lady Susan is a completed epistolary novella. It's written in the form of letters and was one of her early pieces of writing that has survived. So the film Love and Friendship is based on this story, and I didn't quite realise how closely it was based on the actual original text. That film was written and directed by Walt Whitman, who also wrote his own novel from the screenplay. So for some reason I had it kind of in my head that Lady Susan was either unfinished or he'd had to add a lot to the story. But actually, apart from obviously adding dialogue, because his film is like a normal dramatized film, it doesn't involve nearly as many letters, so he'd obviously added that, but the actual story is pretty much as it's written in the original text. So I guess for me, I was kind of going over old ground, and there wasn't much new I was getting from actually reading the story compared to just watching the film, which stars Kate Beckinsale and is actually quite a good film. Stories written in letters are always going to be a little bit clunky, I think, for those of us who are used to just normal prose. However, The Watsons, which is an unfinished excerpt of writing that Jane Austen started when she was living in Bath, that I absolutely loved, and I'm so upset that she never finished that story because I want to find out what happens. It starts off with this girl Emma, who's been brought up by a rich aunt but has now had to return to her family. She has an older sister, Elizabeth, who is taking her to her first ball in a nearby town. Only one of the sisters can go because she has to stay at home to look after their sickly father. And often Jane Austen's books kind of start a little bit slow. She often gives such a lot of description of the people and the place that she's setting her story in. But this one starts in a similar way to Pride and Prejudice, with so much dialogue and action all happening right away, which I found so engaging. I really loved the main character of Emma. She's just kind of super relatable, a little bit more sensible than everyone else around her, but has a bit more spirit to her than your Aunt Elliot or Fanny Price. And all the different characters that you meet in this tiny excerpt are so vividly brought to life. It's funny, Sanditon is the one that has recently been made into a TV series, and the screenwriter Andrew Davies has come up with his own version of what he thought might happen. But I had no interest in finding out more about Sanditon. I want someone to do that to the Watsons. I want to find out more about that story. So Sanditon was the last unfinished work that she was writing before her death. Reading the introduction of this collection, it talks about how in Sanditon the emphasis is less on the individual characters and more about the town, and you can definitely see that in the writing. The main character, especially Charlotte Haywood, is very bland. She's really just a vessel that we see the action through. I actually found the rest of the characters quite Dickensian in a way. They're all a little bit awful and a little bit over the top. I think it probably had a lot of potential. Obviously, we are only seeing a first draft, and who knows how many drafts she made of her other novels before she decided decided to publish them. But yeah, Sanditon was not as engaging to me as the Watsons, but still obviously fascinating to read something so different from what we usually know from her. I'm really glad I read this collection. It was so interesting to read words that Jane Austen herself has written down on the page and them being something new that I'd never read before. So for films that I watched, apart from Persuasion, I also watched Austenland, which is a 2013 film. This stars Kerry Russell as an American woman who is obsessed with Jane Austen and decides to spend her savings on a trip to Austenland in the UK. This is this big house and grounds where you get to dress up as an Austen type character and pretend you're living in the Regency era. I felt this film had so much potential, but there was something about it that was kind of off. The weirdest thing was that there were really no actual Jane Austen references in it. Even something like Pride and Prejudice and zombies, as ridiculous as that concept is and as over the top as that film is, it still manages to get in some references that only Jane Austen fans are going to get, and this film desperately needed something like that. I get that the film is not actually parodying Jane Austen herself or her works. What it's parodying is this fandom that surrounds Jane Austen that tourists, I guess, love to get involved in when potentially they haven't even read any one of her novels. The comedy was very broad and over the top, which is absolutely the opposite of what any kind of Jane Austen thing should be, when her humour was so subtle and clever. However, it was worth watching purely for the fact that J.J. Field, aka Mr. Tilney in the 2007 adaptation, aka the best Jane Austen hero of all time in my opinion, he is in this film. So it was wonderful to see that actor with his very lovely voice, dressed in Regency clothing, saying vaguely Regency things, and so I enjoyed it almost purely for that. So yeah, I wouldn't exactly recommend Austenland, but if you think you're gonna have fun with it, it's not the worst way to spend like an hour and a half. I also decided to watch Clueless because I saw it was on Netflix and it's the 25th anniversary of that film. I have seen Clueless before and I knew I loved it, but this rewatch made me realize that I really love Clueless. On the surface, it doesn't seem like it relates anyway to Jane Austen, aside from obviously being the same plotline as Emma, but actually the way that it parodies its characters and the very silly things that they do and say, and yet at the same time is so sympathetic to them and understanding of them and clearly loves all its characters, is so much how I feel Jane Austen wrote about her characters. It's also such a funny film. I'd forgotten how clever the script is, and I think Alicia Silverstone has impeccable comic timing. She's absolutely not given enough credit for being a really good comedian in this film. It kind of makes me laugh how people often put up Clueless as an example of 90s fashion when reading about the actual costumes in the film, which are such a huge part of it. The costume designer was going the exact opposite of what was actually fashionable at the time. In an interview I read with her, she said that the fashion was all grunge during that era of the 90s, and she did not want that. She wanted everything bright and colourful and happy, and you can clearly see the Regency influences in so many of the costumes that especially Alicia Silverstone wears. If you have not seen Clueless for a long time, I'd highly recommend watching it again. It is such a good time. So that is my Jane Austen July wrap up. Thank you to Katie and Marissa for hosting the event again. It's such a fun event on BookTube and I'm already looking forward to next year. I hope you're all having a great day and I'll see you soon. Bye!